Order, order. Can I welcome everyone to our session of the Home Affairs Select Committee and welcome David Anderson to give evidence before us today. Mr. Anderson, we obviously want to ask you both about your reflections in your previous experience as independent reviewer, but in particular about your most recent review of the terrible events in the lead-up and the terrible terrorist attacks that we experienced in this country last year. We note the tribute that you have paid to the work of security services and the police, who obviously do so much work to keep us safe, but also your reflections on how much they have been also keen to learn lessons as well. And that's, I think, what we want to focus on initially today. So can I ask you to just say something initially about your reflections on the need for better information sharing between both intelligence agencies and the police and also the border force as well?
The intelligence agencies already share a lot with counter-terrorism policing. They work closely together. That relationship is widely envied around the world and widely imitated around the world, not always with the same success that we enjoy here. What I think these reviews illuminated was that intelligence sharing, as you might expect, is much less advanced when it comes to neighbourhood policing, which has its own very important role to play in fighting terrorism. And not just neighbourhood policing, but other agencies as well, be that local authorities, prisons, education authorities, and so on. So the big leap that was made in these internal reviews, which I was simply assessing, was to, and it was a big leap, I think, particularly for MI5, was to decide we've got to let go of a little more of the knowledge we derive from intelligence, and share that out rather more widely than we do at the moment. Now, there are obviously risks in doing that, risks, for example, as to source protection, but you don't have to tell people everything. You only perhaps have to tell the borough commander there is a particular gym in Barking which we think may have been used by people who pose a national security concern. Could you keep an eye on it for us? Or to say to the people policing South Manchester, we know you've got your hands full with other types of crime, some of it quite serious, but you should know that a couple of these gang members are of interest to us also for national security purposes. Can you see what you've got on them? So they would be releasing information in the expectation of getting more information back that would help inform their strategic priorities.
And does that reflection, if the focus there was around the importance of neighbourhood policing, does that then change or inform the assessments in terms of the assessments that you think that police forces should make and the Home Office should make in terms of the significance of neighbourhood policing as part of counter-terror efforts?
I think neighbourhood policing is already recognised to be a vital part of counter-terrorism efforts, not just in the sense that they might sometimes have useful intelligence that will help them to do their job, but because if they are doing their job well, and if they have the resources to do it properly, they will know the communities that they are policing. And what Robert Peel called policing by consent, we nowadays call community policing. It seems to me it is the one great advantage that we have in these islands over the way that policing is done on the continent. If it is done well, and on the whole it is, then one does get a degree of cooperation from communities, which is very helpful for all sorts of reasons.
So given the significant reduction that we've had in neighbourhood policing and some forces saying that proposing actually the ending of neighbourhood policing altogether, should that be a concern for us from a counter-terrorist point of view?
Well, it's always a concern if police don't properly know the community where they're supposed to be operating. But I sense a possible political angle to the question, and I think I'd probably better not go there.
On the information sharing, the relationship with the border force, I think from the outside, the fact that Salman Abedi, the Manchester attacker, was able to travel repeatedly to and from Libya and not to be stopped, and for that not to have been raised as a significant issue in terms of the policing approach, does raise some significant questions. What were your reflections on that?
Well, I would say he is from a part of Manchester where quite a lot of people have family in Libya, quite a lot of people travel to Libya, and it's not the practice of the police to stop everybody with a family connection with a dodgy place. I mean, if it was, they'd be stopping an awful lot more people than they do. And I think what one has to remember about Ebedi is that although there was some minor criminality on his record, and although he was known to have some involvement in gangs, and although he was thought to have had a couple of indirect connections with persons of national security interest, he wasn't really very high up on the radar. He wasn't someone who, certainly until shortly before the attacks, anyone perceived as a major national security threat.
Given that he was a subject of interest at one point, even though that was closed, do you think there was a case for adding to that or for reopening that, given the number of times he had travelled to Libya and back again?
Well, he was a subject of interest twice, but both times it was kind of a mistake. The first time they had intelligence that a dangerous person had been walking through Manchester with somebody else. It was wrongly thought that somebody else might be Salman Ebedi, so for that reason he was made a subject of interest. I think very briefly, once they realised it wasn't him. And then the second time, they thought he was a direct contact of quite a big jihadist in Libya, when in fact they looked more carefully, it turned out that he was just in the address book of somebody else who was a direct contact of the person in Libya. So again, it wasn't as damning as it looked. Having said that, they did slip up at the port because a few months before the attack, as I said in my report, they did have intelligence which, certainly read now, looks very worrying indeed. And they did have the opportunity, once they knew he'd gone to Libya, to put a port stop on him so that when he did come back, he would have been questioned. MI5 accept themselves that would have been the sensible thing to do. It plainly would. As it happened, he came back only 4 days before the attack. So one could question whether it would have made a difference, but it might have done.
And given there's obviously been a lot of discussion by the government of the issues around the people returning from Syria, do you think there should be more significance given to those travelling to and from Libya?
Well, it's very easy for me to sit here and pontificate on operational matters. Libya is obviously a very dangerous place. It is a state that does not enjoy consistent, strong government, and therefore it's the sort of place that jihadis, perhaps driven out of other theatres of war, might be tempted to go and settle, and there is no question about that. My sense of the police and of MI5 is that they are alert to these threats. The directions given to police at the ports and indeed to immigration officials are constantly changing in the light of the threat as it evolves. And I'm not going to sit here and say they're getting it wrong, though I've no doubt, particularly after what we saw in Manchester in June, they will be very alert to the problem that you mentioned.
And would you expect information on individuals travelling to and from somewhere like Libya frequently to be passed to counter-terror intelligence in any way?
Yes, and I think this is actually, you take me on very neatly to the second big change which is suggested as a consequence of these reviews, and that is about squeezing more use out of relevant data. Now, whether that's travel data or whether that's, it could be online purchasing data, for which you might need cooperation of private companies, I suspect there is more to be done. And if you look how clever private sector companies are at using data aggregators, at putting together everything they know about people to make credit reference scores and so on, I think you can see that there is scope for government as well to use data perhaps a little more cleverly than they do. Always, of course, acknowledging that these sort of activities, when done by government, need to be very carefully safeguarded.
Stephen Doughty.
Thanks, Chair. I just had some questions really about the operations in relation to both borders and in terms of forces locally. Do you think there's a problem? We're talking about that issue between the security services and local police forces and sharing information, all the difficulties around that. Do you think there's inherently a problem with geographical forces from elsewhere in the UK going in and conducting operations in one area, both from the point of view of potentially not fully understanding the local context, or conversely not actually having the best intelligence and awareness of the situation that they're going into?
Well, if you're talking about counter-terrorism, and the whole counter-terrorism network as it was established after 7/7 is based, first of all, not just on the Met, but on significant centres of expertise, as you know, in the main regions where terrorism is on the map, indeed, at least to some extent in every region. And it's also based on the idea of interoperability, people being able to come in when they're particularly needed for one purpose. And I remember when the Ipswich murders took place about 200 metres from my house. I was brought in to be interviewed, like I think many of the men on the street, and we were interviewed by police officers from a far distant constabulary who obviously didn't know the town very well. I don't think that was the wrong thing to do. Obviously, people who don't know the area might not function in all ways as well as those who do, but I think it's good that we have police forces that are as flexible as they are, particularly when they're divided up into so many separate forces.
I mean, I can understand that in theory, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, I mean, for example, I would say we have a very strong community policing in South Wales Police, for example, and some very good relationships, and very much that model of policing by consent that you described. But sometimes there have been problems when we've had, whether it's from Manchester or North or whatever, particularly their counter-terrorism units coming in and conducting operations, very necessary operations, but perhaps haven't understood some of the sensitivities there. Yes,
well, I think one just has to look for the greater good. I remember during the G8 summit, a lot of British police officers ended up in Northern Ireland. I think for some of them, that was a bit of a culture shock. But the Northern Irish would still rather have had them there than have them at home.
Okay. I want to ask specifically about ports of exit and detention of individuals. I've become aware of a number of cases recently. I don't want to go into the specific details where individuals are only being removed or detained at the very last stage before boarding aircraft or ships or where else, or even when they've actually boarded. So they've been through, pre-boarding checks. They've probably checked in online. They've gone through the check-in desk. They've gone through security checks, and they're about to get onto a plane, and then they're detained. Now, from my point of view, that strikes me as wrong, both in terms of the fact that if they're an individual of concern, how are they getting that far? But also, if they're then subsequently not charged or found not to be involved in anything they shouldn't be, they, for example, will miss their flights, miss their transport, and don't appear to get any compensation as a result. Is that how the system is supposed to work?
Well, ideally, of course, it doesn't work like that. No one wants it to work like that because there's a potential for creating a very bad image if you take somebody off the plane. But I think you probably accept that if, for the sake of argument, those people were 3 schoolgirls on their way to Turkey, perhaps intending to head on to Syria after that, it would still be something that's worth doing. It might be something you would like to take up with my successor, Max Hill, because he'll be more up to date than I am on this one. But what the police told me when I used to put these stories to them is we're always trying to get better advance notice of who's on the plane. As soon as they get the passenger manifest from the airline, they can start running checks. But certainly in the past, I think it's getting better. It hasn't always been possible to get those details in time to check things in quite the way one would have liked. And it may be that it's in a case like that where they end up actually having to take somebody off the plane.
And would it be your expectation that, for example, an individual who is wrongly detained, turns out they've got nothing to hide, they haven't got any problems at all, subsequently not charged, that they should, for example, if their travel was disrupted, they're not able to get on the flight they were supposed to, that should be compensated in some way?
Well, perhaps it should depend whether the police are in any way at fault, which of course they may have been. The other possibility is the people who miss their planes because they're being questioned for such a long period of time. The police, I think, are as helpful as they can be in trying to get alternative bookings made and so on, but certainly if people suffer financial loss for that sort of reason, then I would think, yes, compensation may have to be looked at.
Okay. Asking about foreign fighters, people who've been involved in, particularly in Syria and Iraq, and following a little bit on from what the chair was saying, there were some significant concerns, and forgive me if you're not aware of any details of this, that there were a significant number of British individuals who were allowed to escape Raqqa in particular. There's a BBC investigation into this by Quentin Somerville and others. And it's believed that they may well have travelled to other locations, whether it's Libya, whether it's Afghanistan, and so on. And obviously we've seen Daesh linked attacks in Afghanistan in recent days. Is there a wider concern that individuals may travel to a third location, Libya, Afghanistan, elsewhere, and then make it back to the UK at some point once they've committed further atrocities?
Well, some almost certainly want to die and have died or will die out there. Others may want to come back. My sense is that we're not seeing as many, certainly in recent months, returning as some might have expected. And others will try their luck in some other theatre or some other part of the Middle East or elsewhere, which I think is what you're describing. I'm sure battle-hardened jihadists are a menace wherever they are in the world.
Mm. But they may then, some of them may then choose to return to the UK even at the end of that process.
Well, they may. As I say, my sense is we are not seeing at the moment returners in great numbers. That could always change.
Okay. Shall I ask a question about the online stuff now or come back later? Yeah, no problem.
The police and security services are supposed to be aware of around 3,000 people with active involvement in terrorism in some way, and that may just be the tip of the iceberg before those who may then be coming back were just referenced. What's your analysis as regard the sort of supply and demand of police, everything from community-led services through to the full-blown intelligence services, to be able to look out for that level of potential threat? Well,
they are stretched. I'm sure you've heard from others. I think you have heard from Mark Rowley that there was a big uptick in the number of suspected plots around the beginning of last year, actually a couple of months before the Westminster attacks. And that's continued at pretty much the same level since. I don't think it's continued to grow, but I understand it hasn't fallen either. Everything these people do, everything the police and security services do in this field is a question of priorities. They're weighing up relative threats, they're deciding where to put their resources. And you saw, for example, in what I was able to write about the London Bridge case, that although they were on to Khurram Butt, one of the perpetrators, and although they had associated him with possible attack planning, certainly back in 2015, he seemed after that to get interested in other things, they did twice have to suspend their investigation into him for resourcing reasons. And that's not unusual. It's something that happens quite a lot because resources are not infinite. Does that mean that they're struggling and that they're not on top of the problem? No, I don't think it does. It's quite unnerving as an outsider to go in there, to spend some time with an analyst, to look at the stuff that's coming onto his or her screen every day, and to ask yourself, how do they make these decisions and how confident can they be that the right investigations are being prioritised? Of course, one could spend infinite money. We already spend £3 billion on counter-terrorism, not counting borders and prosecutions, and one could spend more. But I think at the end of the day, one has to reflect that in the last 4 years, more than 20 attacks prevented, and despite the horrific events of last year, and one could not feel worse for the families and survivors, one still has to reflect that those were the only mass casualty terrorist attacks we've had since 7/7 in 2005. So looked at overall, I would say they are on top of the problem, but neither they nor I could offer any undertaking that more people won't from time to time get through.
And to be more on top of the problem, where would additional resources best be concentrated in your view?
Well, in, I think, November 2015, so after Charlie Hebdo, there was a huge uplift in counter-terrorism resources, directed particularly at MI5, which is at the moment in the process of expanding its numbers, I think, from about 4,000 to about 5,000. And my sense is that they're probably absorbing that extra capacity about as fast as they can. Yeah. You'll be aware of the time it takes to get people security cleared and all the rest of it. The police will tell you that they do need more money, but and I'm sure they could put the money to good use. But again, I'm really reluctant to be dragged into debate on this, because I'm conscious that there are many priorities. There are many other ways, horrible ways, that people get killed.
Sure. Without getting you to comment on where there are potentially current shortfalls in police operations generally, just to look more strategically, both from a preventative point of view as well as a day-to-day operational point of view. If we had more agents there, would they be able to have more surveillance of certain intelligence operations or whatever? But in the longer term, more strategically, if resources, either existing resources, are to be used better, or more resources are to be used more effectively to try and cut off the supply of terrorism and inclinations to do terrorist things, where do you think we should be changing our strategy or prioritising our strategy or what, just on a strategic view?
Well, a lot of people talk about de-radicalisation. Everything I know about de-radicalisation is that it's extremely difficult, and it's much better if you can persuade people not to be radicalised in the first place. And there we get into the area, I suppose, of prevent and whether that's as effective as it could be, which is perhaps something else you'll want to talk about. On the operational side, these allocations are constantly reviewed, and there are difficult decisions to be made. For example, as a consequence of the two changes that I've mentioned, the better use of data and the greater intelligence sharing, you're going to end up with more leads coming into MI5, potentially more suspicious people, more difficult decisions about who you follow up, potentially more subjects for investigation. Now, where is the resource for that going to come? Is it going to come from people we've already identified as the highest priority risk? Now, that's not an easy decision. What MI5 decided was that there would be some modest reallocation so as to ensure that the people who are former subjects of interest and perhaps some of these new leads, there would be resource to deal with those as well. But at the end of the day, you can't say with certainty what's going to work best until you've tried it. I think there is a slight element of operational judgment there, which it's quite difficult for someone like me just to parachute in and declare upon.
Okay, but I'm guessing you wouldn't say that we are close to reaching a successful tipping point, at which point potential terrorists or terrorists potentially about to commit atrocities decide actually the risk-reward ratio is too low because the intelligence services and counter-terrorism services generally are on top of the situation too much, therefore actually we'll go somewhere else. You're not saying that we are as on top of it to actually deter people from continuing to try, or are you? But it's not the impression I'm getting, in which case surely the refocus needs to be to the prevent strategy and nipping into that in the first place, which is why quite interesting about your mention of as sort of grassroots level as neighbourhood policing and neighbourhood intelligence. And are we in some ways sort of just focusing too much on the firefighting at the top of intelligence gathering rather than taking a much more strategic view that we actually need to be at the grassroots before the grass actually grows? I mean, just your general view on how good we really are.
Well, I think in terms of how our security services are perceived by potential terrorists, I think the perception is they are pretty fierce and they are pretty effective. And that may well be the reason, or one of the reasons, why we aren't seeing very many of these foreign fighters returning to try their luck in the UK. They know that if they do, they are very likely to be picked up at the port. They'll be prosecuted if they possibly can be. And if not, we have a range of orders, including some rather extreme executive orders, as well as covert surveillance, that they could be subject to. So I think also if you listen, as I've been able to do, to the conversations that these people have when they are under surveillance, there is not the sense, oh, we can say anything we like, they're not going to be onto us. There is a sense that we have very good intelligence agencies. And I think that's also the perception in the US, on the continent of Europe, among our intelligence partners. They think we're quite good at what we do. And although, of course, the solution to the problem in the long run is not is more than just keeping a lid on it. We have to keep a lid on it as well. And of those 3,000 people you mentioned, they're not all interested in attack planning, probably only a few hundred in that category. But there are others interested in funding, in facilitation of travel. And you need to keep tabs on these people to varying degrees because they have the potential to do us harm. So I don't think one can take money out of that, certainly not in the current threat climate. The time may come, and who knows what the psychological effect will be of the collapse of the Islamic State. A lot of these young men, boys that go out there, they're attracted by winners. Just like the boy who wants to support Manchester City. You're going to go for somebody that's winning. And when it starts losing and looking a bit ridiculous and being defeated, maybe it's the sort of thing that will turn the tide. Now, I'm not wishing to sound over-optimistic here, but no terrorist movement lasts forever. I'm quite sure that we are in some kind of a generational struggle here, but we can't be sure that the threat is going to continue forever at the very elevated level it's at the moment. But I would say for as long as it is at that level, there is really no substitute for the sort of things we're doing under Pursue and the sort of things that MI5 and the other agencies are doing to keep a lid on it. And in terms of the methods used, I mean, here we obviously get into things that it's not easy to talk about in any public setting. But there are various types of intelligence. There is human intelligence, there is digital intelligence, there is open source intelligence. All are important, and what the intelligence agencies and the police are trying to do is to keep on top of, in particular, new technologies as they emerge, so as to enable them to do the best job they can.
I think just to follow up, what would be interesting to understand is, given your many years of experience observing this area, is what you would see as being the priority for say, further investment. So if you had 20 million, for example, additional to spend, which area would you put it into? Whether that be about neighbourhood policing, whether that be about MI5 operation, whether that be about Pursue, Prevent. If you were looking at it in terms of drawing on all of that experience, what would you say actually is the area, to be honest, this is the thing we should be doing more of or pushing further on right now?
Well, I suspect just at the moment I probably want more analysts in G branch of MI5. But that's not something you can just snap your fingers and have happen. There's recruitment, there's training involved, and hopefully in a few years' time that same demand won't be there. In terms of policing, it seems artificial to think about it purely in terms of counter-terrorism because of course police do all sorts of jobs. But certainly anything that helps police remain in touch with the communities they have to police, I think, can only be a good thing.
Naz Shah.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question leads on from what the Chair has just asked. So which issues and reforms should the government prioritise in its ongoing review of its counter-terrorism strategy?
OK, well, can I give you it's a bit late for a Christmas list, but let me mention two or three things. There is a power already to stop people at the ports in order to determine whether they're a terrorist. Schedule 7 to the Terrorism Act. That's the only reason you can use it, in order to determine whether someone is a terrorist. It became obvious to me during my time as independent reviewer that police were using this power also to stop people who might be spies or who might be involved in nuclear proliferation. So I asked the police to quantify for me, by reference to the intelligence reports that they got out of these stops, what proportion related to counter-espionage and counter-proliferation. And over a 5-year period, they said that counter-espionage accounted for 5 to 8% of their intelligence reports, and counter-proliferation accounted for 8 to 17% of their intelligence reports. And whenever I go to police conferences, or whenever I used to go to police conferences, people would often come up to me and say, is it right that I'm being asked to stop a Chinese student, for example, on the basis he might be a terrorist, or an Iranian nuclear engineer? I think there was a slight uneasiness in some quarters that quite a narrow power was being extended, no doubt for very good operational reasons, to try and encompass people who didn't really fall within it. And we saw this is not a theoretical concern. We saw it at Heathrow Airport in 2013 when Mr. David Miranda, Glenn Greenwald's partner, was caught coming through Heathrow. He was carrying lots of stolen documents. Now, he might have been a thief, he might have been a spy, but the only power they had to stop him was under the Terrorism Act. So we ended up with years of litigation in the courts in which they tried to demonstrate that, in fact, he might have been a terrorist. And in fact, the courts said, well, yes, just about he might have been a terrorist, so it was okay. But I don't think that's good for the definition of terrorism, and I don't think it's good for the rule of law. So I've said several times, why don't you give yourselves the power to stop people on a similar basis who pose an equal but different threat to national security for one of those two reasons? So that would be one thing I'd like to see in. On the other side of the coin, because obviously I'm looking out for civil liberties as well as trying to strengthen powers, I think the proscription of organisations has become a one-way street. No one is ever deprescribed unless they go to the courts, and the Home Office fights till the last, and most people can't afford that, and anyway, a lot of people don't want to put their heads above the parapet and say, I represent a terrorist organisation. It got to the stage where the Home Office admitted to me, as independent reviewer, that no fewer than 14 international organisations were proscribed as terrorist organisations, despite the fact that they did not satisfy the statutory requirements for proscription. So this was not an area where you could say, well, the Home Secretary's judgment, it's not for anyone else to question that. This was an area where the Home Office themselves were admitting to me, and allowing me to publish, incidentally, which I did twice, that these organisations did not even meet the statutory criterion of likely to engage in terrorism. Now, again, that seems to me an issue of the rule of law. What they say is, well, if they don't like it, they can apply. But I think in practical terms, as we've seen, that's very difficult. So that's another thing I'd change. But I think the third thing, I don't think we need wholesale reform of our laws. We've already got a lot of criminal offences. A lot of them are what I call precursor offences, so they go back well before the stage of an attempt or a conspiracy or an incitement. But I think there might be room for a little bit of tweaking, particularly when you're looking at the sort of hate preacher area. I recorded in my last report that Anjan Chowdhury, now eventually in prison, was referred unsuccessfully to the Crown Prosecution Service 10 times for prosecution, while they tried to get him on various other offences that couldn't quite be made to stick. And I suggested in my last report a couple of tweaks that might at least be thought about. One of them, for example, there's an offence of encouraging people to engage in terrorism, quite right too, but that offence can only be committed in a public place. Now, my suggestion, it might be controversial, it would need debate, but let's at least think about making it an offence to encourage someone privately to engage in terrorism. That might enable, for example, the police to get somebody into the living room who was able to report back to them. They might have the evidence for a prosecution or a conviction. I'm not saying that has to be done tomorrow. I'm saying I think anyone who thinks honestly about this realises that, particularly where hate preachers are concerned, we do need to keep the law under review. And I hope when we see the counter-terrorism bill, that I think is promised for later this year, some thought will have been given to those things.
Thank you. Which actually brings me up to any other major outstanding issues that you'd like to see addressed, in particular reference to the assessment of current sentencing and control regime for terrorist suspects.
Well, the Chair remembers very well the ins and outs of control orders and TPIMs. We now have what I call TPIM Mark II, which is halfway back from TPIMs to control orders. What was wrong about control orders was that they could be given indefinitely, and I thought that was just unjustifiable. If you can't convict someone in a court of law, you can't keep them under constraint forever. And they're now limited to 2 years. I think that's right. But where I think, as we can now see from the evidence, the coalition government went too far was removing the power to relocate people when they were on TPIMs. Consequence of that, people started escaping, and there was a certain amount of reluctance after that to use them because they didn't appear very safe, and because there was no doubt a political price as well to be paid for using them. So what we now have is 2-year TPIMs with the ability to relocate. And they're still not used in large numbers. I think at the last count there are 6 or 7 in force. But then you don't want to use too many of them, because if someone is under a TPIM, you have effectively tipped them off. And therefore they're very unlikely to do anything that might cause them to be prosecuted. And it's also very expensive to keep someone under a TPIM, very expensive, not least because of the risk they might abscond and embarrass everybody, as well as damaging national security. And they deprive you of flexibility to assign your resources somewhere else. So I think TPIMs Mark II work better than control orders and better than TPIMs Mark I. But sorry, you asked about something else as well.
So it was about assessment of a current sentencing and
sentencing.
regime.
Well, terrorism sentencing is already really high. Now, I'm sure that one of the things that is being looked at as they're looking at this new bill is bound to be, are the sentences high enough? Could we be doing more? And I think what the police say is we're all about disrupting terrorists. The best way to disrupt them is to convict them of something and put them away for a very long time. And I do understand that. And I don't have any particular view on any sentencing changes there might be. I would just point out that if you compare it with Northern Ireland, the sentences seem to me to be a very long way apart. Similar offence in Northern Ireland will tend to result in a much lower sentence. I'm not saying that's because Northern Ireland gets everything right, and there it may be influenced by historic factors, going back to the Belfast Agreement and special arrangements at that time that were made for convicted prisoners. But certainly when you have the job of looking at both, as I did, the distinction is quite striking. And that's the sort of area, I think, where my successor, Max Hill, is placed probably to do a better job than me, because he is a proper criminal barrister who's been in the criminal courts all his life and who will have a very acute feel for these kinds of things. One thing I would welcome, and I believe it may be happening, but apologies if I'm not fully up to date, is the adoption of some sentencing guidelines in relation to terrorism offences by the Sentencing Council, effectively by the judges themselves. Because I think this is an area where people need to be sure that there are strong principles consistently applied. In particular, Muslim groups would often say to me, how unfair it was. They'd take an example of an ex-soldier who was done for some right-wing extremism, and then they'll take an example of a Muslim who'd been sentenced to much longer, and they'd say this isn't fair. Now, it's always difficult to compare individual cases with each other, but if you've got a proper framework and guidelines and indicative ranges for sentence and so on, then I think it becomes much easier to show people that the system we have in England and Wales, and no doubt same thing in Scotland, is fair.
Thank you. You've actually answered one of my questions that I put further down, which was the applicability in Northern Ireland, so thank you for that. So what is the appropriate law enforcement response, do you think, to British citizens and residents returning from fighting in Daesh in Iraq and Syria?
Well, they should be prosecuted if they can be, and my understanding is quite a number have been, although I couldn't put a percentage on that. Of course, it's always difficult to convict people for offences they've committed abroad, particularly when the foreign government is not particularly likely to be giving you much assistance, as would certainly be the case with Syria. But that should be the first option. In relation to the others, well, I think all these people need to be looked at very carefully indeed, and I'm afraid my first reaction would not be to look at them in a particularly generous spirit. I think the starting point has to be that these are potentially very dangerous people. We've seen a large number return in the past, but if you talk to the security services, what they will tend to tell you is the ones who've come back tend to be the ones who went in the early days, maybe for very good reasons. Maybe they went out there as charitable workers and then they stayed, or they got in with the wrong crowd, or they went out of curiosity, or they went to get married to somebody or to live in an ideal state. And some of those people were disillusioned and do need to be treated sensitively when they come back. I think the ones who stayed out there past the beheadings of 2014, past the battles and so on, one has to be quite sceptical. Now, that's not to say that they're all evil. I mean, human beings are very complicated. But there are, fortunately, even for the ones that we can't prosecute, a lot of things we can do. I mean, you've mentioned TPIMs, temporary exclusion orders. There are other kinds of surveillance which may have the advantage that they're not actually aware of it, and therefore, if they do start engaging in terrorist activity, then they can be picked up for that. And, of course, there is Prevent, and there is the Channel programme. I made a radio programme on Prevent, which was aired in July of last year, and the first interview in that programme, it actually wasn't with a Muslim, it was with a 20-year-old ex-Nazi. But he was explaining how he'd been experimenting with explosives. Actually, a couple of Northern Irishmen, his father's age, had been getting him into this and helping him prepare for the race war and showing him how to kill Muslims. And they were buying bomb ingredients off the internet, they were letting them off in a quarry. And he became homeless and rootless. And he was picked up in a hostel where he was staying because somebody was a bit alarmed by the way he was talking. He was referred to the Channel programme. He agreed to cooperate with that. And to hear him speak now in that radio programme demonstrated to me that whatever its faults, for some people at least, Prevent can really work marvels. So that's an option as well for some people.
That brings me nicely on it. It's as if you've read my notes. It brings me nicely onto the Prevent issue. So Peter Fahey in 2015 talked about Prevent and how it could possibly be alienating the communities. And you certainly talked about it in 2015 in your, I think it was the... so in February 2015 you said it can, again the same words, it could work if it is right. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about the Prevent strategy and then come on to your recommendations you've made. So to what extent does the current Prevent strategy, launched in 2011, differ from the one that preceded it?
Well, I should preface all my answers by saying, of course, I was never the independent reviewer of Prevent. I just got inquisitive about Prevent because when I come places like this, it's what people really want to ask me about, or did want to ask me about. But I probably don't need to tell you what the main changes were. But one was to open it up very explicitly, not just to Islamist terrorism, but to other kinds of terrorism as well. One was to direct it towards not just violent extremism, but to non-violent extremism. And one was to couple it with what has been called, I think, by Baroness Varsi, a disengagement strategy. I don't know if that's quite a fair way of putting it or not, but certainly what it amounted to was that the government was paying fewer people and also talking to a smaller range of people, particularly in Muslim communities, than it had done before, which was all three things, I think, were controversial.
Okay. So towards the end of your term as independent reviewer, you called for Prevent to be subject to an independent oversight, for the strategy to be managed on a cross-departmental basis with an evidence on safeguarding rather than terrorism. How likely is it that the government will implement your recommendations?
Well, it certainly hasn't done everything I said, but I think there has been some movement. And the first thing I asked for was transparency, because it seemed to me, particularly when I went around mosques and so on, there were a lot of stories out there, and a lot of people were quite reasonably saying, we don't really know who's being subjected to this, it's all secret, it's all part of the secret state. The government has responded to that. It produced a document, can't remember the month, but it was towards the back end of last year, in which they set out for the first time proper statistics broken down by region in terms of who went through Channel, how many extreme right-wing, what happened to prevent referrals. Answer, some of them ended up in Channel, but a lot ended up in mental health or addiction or other treatments. So I would give them, good marks for at least having started that process. I think there's more to do. The second thing I said is there had to be more engagement with communities. I still think they should talk to more people than they do. But I think locally in particular, there are some examples of quite good engagement. And if you look at somewhere like Hammersmith and Fulham, where there's a Prevent Advisory Group, brings in people from the community, it occupies a lot of time, it's a lot of hard work, it presumes on the goodwill of those who agree to come in, but I think it certainly has benefits. You look at somewhere like Leicester, where I've myself gone a couple of times to talk to people in the community about Prevent, and there are plenty of other examples too. I think probably more to be done on that. Then in an independent review, I thought it was a winner for the government, because if they wanted people to trust their strategy, just like they want people to trust their terrorism laws, they put someone like me in who can look under all the stones and then report back and say, well, I didn't like that one, but actually the rest is not too bad. And if they were confident in their product, I was encouraging them to do that. They haven't done that. But what I would say on that is that since I made those calls, there have been some independent reviews. In particular, there was one from the universities of Durham, Huddersfield and Coventry into the operation of Prevent in schools, where they interviewed, I think, more than 300 teachers and educators in West Yorkshire and London, and came up with some pretty clear conclusions about how Prevent was perceived by teachers in schools. And I suppose the headline was, it wasn't nearly as bad as some people were saying. And I consider that useful objective evidence, which it's good to have out there. Although, again, I think there are other aspects of Prevent that certainly need attention as well. Then you mentioned the cross-departmental thing. And I mentioned that really because I was lucky enough to speak to the security minister in Canada, where they have not moved as fast as we have with Prevent, but I was talking to the minister about how they'd set it up and said, did you learn lessons from the way we do it in the UK? And he indicated very politely that, yes, he felt they had. I didn't get the sense that all the lessons were necessarily positive ones. But one thing he said was that they were locating it there not in the equivalent of the Home Office. They didn't want to give people the idea it was securitized. Instead, it was being located in an independent office into which there would be cross-departmental input. And that seemed to me, particularly when you're looking at an area like schools, or indeed universities, maybe a positive direction in which to go. But they've been reviewing Prevent for months and years. I'm told there is to be a contest revision, probably sometime this year. I thought it was going to be probably sometime last year. So I guess we'll have to see, what that looks like when it comes out.
So do you think, David, do you think Prevent needs a rebrand or more fundamental reforms needed to regain the trust of the Muslim communities?
Well, I think it's all about trust. If what you're trying to do is to convene the great middle of this country, all of us basically wanting the same things, wanting to live a peaceful family life with decent jobs and all the rest of it, and if you want to bring those people together against those of violence on the extremes, and I say extremes in the plural, then you've somehow got to bring them with you. And I don't see how you do that except by talking to them and by helping them trust what you are proposing, or indeed, better still, engage them in the business of making the proposals. I mean, that would seem to me absolutely fundamental.
So how important, then, is it to have an actual definition of extremism to be able to regain the trust of the Muslim community?
Well, I've always had some difficulty in understanding the counter-extremism strategy and exactly what it's about. The first reason is the one you give. How do you define extremism? And I think we've seen various attempts to do that. I mentioned in my last report in December that the police, when they're looking at so-called domestic extremism, as it's still called, have three competing definitions on the go. And although they asked for a single definition in 2012, they haven't been given one. So that is very difficult. Then I think a second gap in my own understanding of the counter-extremism strategy is how it fits in with Prevent. And the government always insists that it's quite different from Prevent. I think it's possibly, though, stopping the same sort of extremism being shown in a different direction. I'm not quite sure. Certainly if you look at the Prevent Higher Education guidance, for example, it's partly about making sure that people with extremist views don't come and speak in universities. So, I find that just a little difficult to grasp. And then the third difficulty I had with it was perhaps not so much with the strategy as with the counter-extremism bill that was announced in the Queen's speech in 2015 and 2016. It's not that I think a counter-extremism strategy is a bad thing. If it's about encouraging people to see the virtues of diversity and tolerance, and if it's I would have no difficulty with funding people, funding civil society groups, community groups who want to put out a positive message, whether that's about female emancipation or against groomers or against Islamophobia or anything else. That seems to me utterly a right function of government. And for myself, I wouldn't criticise people who take money to do that thing. But where I have difficulty is if it suddenly becomes coercive. And that's where I think you go back to the definition. If you can't define what you're talking about, well, it doesn't stop you having policies. I mean, who can define mental health problems? But it doesn't stop us having mental health interventions. But when you start having coercive laws and say we're going to put people under extremism disruption orders if they indulge in extremist activity, and you can't define extremist activity except by reference to, not promoting British values or something like that, then I think you're in trouble, because the criminal law, coercive law of any kind, can't afford to be as vague as that. So I don't really understand at the moment, what the Counter-Extremism Commission is being designed to do. I saw a reference in the job description to stopping the scourge of extremism, and if that means the sort of coercive measure that I've described, then I think I have reservations about it. I wrote a report which you were kind enough to cite in a speech in Parliament, Ms. Shah, in which I pointed out 15 difficulties that I thought there would be with such an approach. But then it also says that the aim is to discuss with individuals from all areas of society. And my understanding from the new lead commissioner is that that is how she intends to begin. So far as I'm concerned, the jury is out. But if I might permit myself a comment on the new lead commissioner's appointment, I'm very encouraged by two things. One is her insistence on human rights as a starting point for this. I don't think human rights is in any way an impediment to countering extremism. I think it is a basis for countering extremism. And the second point is that in evidence to the Joint Committee on Human Rights in 2016, she expressed what I would describe, I hope I'm not maligning her, but as views very similar to mine on the sort of coercive laws that were being proposed in 2015-2016. I did not get the impression from her evidence that that was the approach that she thought was going to be productive.
Okay, so that leaves me to two things really. So you and I have had many conversations on Prevent and the issue of Prevent not having the trust of the community. I agree insofar as that human rights experience is very important and it doesn't impede the discussion around extremism. So while seeing as you have brought it up, this particular appointment, then I would ask you this. Given your experience and interest in Prevent and the conversations that you and I have had with Muslim groups, and given that over 100 Muslim organisations have written to the Home Secretary, including my own letter to the Home Secretary, then does that not worry you that we do not have, again, once as Prevent didn't command and remains to not command the trust of the wider Muslim community, the mainstream Muslim community, and we have the Muslim Women's Network, the largest Muslim women's organisation in the country, actually coming out and refusing to engage? Have we just not gone through an exercise of starting a failure before we've even started?
Well, my understanding is that the new Commission is not all about Islamist extremism. I certainly hope it isn't all about Islamist extremism. And it's important, obviously, that the Commission has credibility with the country as a whole. And the only other point I'd make is that, as I understand it, the lead Commissioner is one among others. What I would say is give her a fair chance, wait until the Commission is assembled, and wish her the best of luck. I suspect she may need it.
I would agree with your latter point. I think that's a conversation for another hearing, really, because I can't agree with the rest of it. I do not feel she commands the respect of the community. I do not see any experience with right-wing extremism, which brings me on to my next question. In terms of Prevent and the issue of right-wing extremism, what are we trying to do here when we're talking about the objective of countering extremism? Because is it because extremism leads to violence and we do not want the violence? Or is it because extremism is bad and we don't like it, and that's thought policing, which is what Sir Peter Fahy talked about? And in all of this conversation, there seems to be an emphasis on Islamist extremism as opposed to right-wing. So we've seen a massive rise in the right-wing extremism.
I think those of us from, if I may put it this way, the majority community could always usefully turn on ourselves what we're proposing should be turned on minority communities. And the sort of people who say, oh, why didn't the Muslims turn in X, Y or Z, may also perhaps have to ask themselves, why is it that the other people in that pub didn't turn in A, B or C? Or why didn't the people who heard that foul rant have something to say about it in return? So I agree that there are two sides to that coin, and I'd also agree with you that this is part of the reason why the state has to tread extremely carefully in terms of policing extremism. Yes, of course it must police the law and prosecute people who infringe the law when it's in the public interest to do so. But if you're getting close to the state having an opinion on what opinions the rest of us had, then, well, it's a bit like Queen Elizabeth I, who said she wasn't going to make windows into men's souls. I think that's still quite a good basis on which the state should proceed.
So just to confirm, so your continued view is that the government shouldn't be trying to legislate on on a definition for extremism and shouldn't be proposing additional coercive measures on extremism?
Well, I just think it's very difficult to go down the route of coercion when you can't properly define what you're talking about. And I can only assume that government lawyers for more than a year were trying to reach a definition that they could advise would stand up in a court. And that counter-extremism bill, twice announced in Queen's speeches, never saw the light of day. So I think that would be difficult. I'm not against a counter-extremism strategy, because one can promote things, as with my example of mental health, without needing a particularly precise definition of what it is you're talking about. But in terms of coercive rules, I think you have to be very careful. And that's how I've read the public statements of the lead commissioner as well, for which I salute him.
Thank you. Christopher Cho.
Can I take you back to what you were saying about possibly bringing in new offences of encouraging people to engage in terrorism, whether in a public or private space? And you were saying that that might be contained in a new bill being brought forward by the government.
Well, I don't know what's in the bill.
No.
I was recycling a few of my own recommendations.
Yes, but surely if we are going to legislate in an area like that, we need to prepare the ground. Somebody's got to start floating this as an idea seriously and start providing some draft definitions to it and looking at how it would stand up in law and why we need it and so on. Are you, I mean, obviously you're no longer doing the job you were doing, but do you see anybody engaging in that at the moment, whether it be in the Home Office or anywhere else in the government or elsewhere?
Well, I'm not aware of a consultation on it, which is all I suggested. But that may be because they thought it was a rotten idea and they're not going to do it, and you'd have to ask them about that.
I see. So that's really, would you expect a consultation or something like that before it was the subject of legislation?
Well, I think it would be sensible to consult as widely as possible on these things.
Exactly.
Although I should say that Ms. Shah has raised the question of perceptions in Muslim communities and so on, and I've never found really any substantial resentment about the criminal law and the way the criminal offences are framed, even though they are quite extensive. There seems to be a very strong feeling, well, if that's the law, that's the law. And what people are much more worried about are things which they see as indiscriminately aimed at Muslims, be that stop and search as it used to be, or be that prevent.
Yes. So that sort of takes us on, in a sense, to what encryption of communications, because the government is saying that if you weren't able to have encrypted communications, then it would make life a lot easier in dealing with terrorism. It seems as though they may be going down such a route in Australia. What do you think about this? Do you think the government's ever going to achieve access to encrypted communications for these security purposes?
No.
Because of what?
Because end-to-end encryption is not only a fact of life, it is, on balance, a desirable fact of life. Any of us who do our banking online, for example, are very grateful for end-to-end encryption. And I think one has to remember two other things. First, that does not mean that the tech companies can't do more to help government. They can, even the ones with business models based on end-to-end encryption, as I understand it, could do more than they do. But the other thing I would balance it with is that, yes, it's more difficult to get hold of the content of someone's communications than it was when they just used a BT landline or even an unencrypted mobile. But on the other hand, at the same time, you have all these new sources of intelligence coming in. I mean, who would have thought 30 years ago you can track someone's movements around London by their Oyster card? But you don't really even need the Oyster card anymore, because if you can get the location data from the phone company, and at the moment we do have that location data, it's almost as good as having someone on their tail the whole time. Even, if you look at a modern car, I mean, I've just got a new car. It's been a very long time since I had a new car, and it was like stepping into a new age. My car now remembers who's been sitting in it pretty much every journey it's ever had, because it politely asks whether the different people sitting in it would like to connect their phones. And I don't know what use the car companies make of these data, but you could see that if you were looking at this from the perspective of the police or the intelligence agencies, you'd be looking at another big source of information. So yes, the content may be diminishing, and that may be undesirable from a law enforcement point of view, but I think one has to balance that with all the communications data that's coming in. I mean, most strikingly, in the new Investigatory Powers Act, the internet connection records, which will enable them to ask your broadband provider for a note of all the websites that you've been on in the last year and when you've been on them. And that information can be used for a wide variety of purposes. The more people live their lives online, the more revealing that behaviour becomes about what they were doing. So my sense is it's sometimes portrayed in very black and white terms as the world is going dark and because of encryption we're all doomed. I'm not trying to downplay the significance of that. I think it is very significant, but I think it is being balanced by new sources of intelligence and information coming in all the time. And in a sense, we're in a sort of an arms race where, to my mind, neither side utterly predominates.
Fascinating. Thank you. So the tech companies, you say, could do more. What more do you think they could do?
Well, the response to end-to-end encryption, or one of the responses, was the practice of equipment interference, which is a very polite name for hacking or the implantation of malware when done by the state. This was secret until 2015, but it was avowed at that stage and is now provided for very fully in the Investigatory Powers Act and associated codes of practice. Now, my understanding is that if you want to interfere with a mobile device or a laptop or whatever it might be, it can be a lot easier if one has the cooperation, if not of the manufacturer of the device, then possibly of someone who provides an app that might be used on the device. I suspect that's as far as I should go down that line. But certainly there are things that could be done, falling far short of providing a back door that could still be useful.
Yes. And what about what they're trying to do in Australia? Are you up to speed with what?
Not fully up to date with that, I'm afraid. No.
Okay, right.
No.
And so, what about the Investigatory Powers Act? I mean, there seems to be a lot of discussion about whether we're going to be able to do what we want to with that, with EU law et al. Where do you think we're getting to with that?
Well, we had a Court of Appeal judgment this morning. After the case brought, I must give in credit, David Davis and Tom Watson, challenging the rather venerable and I'd always thought rather benign practice of requiring telecoms companies to keep records of whom we phoned when, how long the conversation lasted, and where we were. Of course, it was a landline, it was obvious where you were. If it's a mobile, you get access to location data to tell you those things. And the court in December 2016, the European Court of Justice, the court of the EU, gave quite a controversial ruling in which they suggested that what they called the general and indiscriminate retention of data for law enforcement purposes was unlawful, although it seemed that it was all right if you kept it only in respect of people in particular areas where there was a high likelihood of serious crime. And then even in those areas, they said, or to the extent that it was lawful, they set out various conditions. And what the Court of Appeal has done this morning is interpret that judgment in part and said, well, in future you must have independent authorization of requests for communications data from telecoms companies. So in other words, the police can't authorise it themselves. There's got to be a new body to authorise it. That body is already being set up. The government anticipated this. It's called OCTA, the Office of Communications Data Authorisation. I think they're trying to find sites for it as we speak, and they're beginning to recruit and train for it. So that was the main thing they said. There was another aspect as well, which was about limiting it to serious crime. And the government's consulted on that. The consultation was closed. They suggest serious crime should be anything for which the maximum sentence is 6 months or more, which doesn't sound serious to everybody, but that's the basis on which they've consulted. However, these are really only the foothills, as you suggest in your question, because I'm sure that these conditions could be swallowed without undue difficulty. The real question is, do we in this country practice general and indiscriminate retention by issuing retention notices to telecoms companies? And there's a dispute about that, and that will be resolved in a High Court case that's going to be heard in February. The implications of that one are huge, and just as huge is the bigger issue still. This was the plain vanilla data retention as practiced for years and used in criminal courts up and down the country. But what about the bulk collection of data by intelligence agencies, by tapping cables coming across the Atlantic, for example? Is that going to fall foul of the same principle? And there are two cases on that. One is in Strasbourg, in front of the European Court of Human Rights, which was heard last year. We're waiting for judgment on that. And the second is in Luxembourg, the Court of the EU, where a reference was made by the Investigatory Powers Tribunal last year. So those two really big questions still have to be resolved.
And obviously we subscribe to the European Convention on Human Rights, whatever happens on the 29th of March next year. So we'd be bound by that judgment. Would that judgment also apply to in the EU as well?
Well, there isn't. I don't want to tire everybody with the law, but there is a national security exception in the EU treaty. And the reason the Investigatory Powers Tribunal asked whether it even had to look at EU law was because it seemed to them that this exception must apply to anything that the intelligence agencies were doing. And if that's right, the EU court will say so, and only the police will have to worry about the EU. Save only for this, in the European Convention on Human Rights, whose case law has been rather more moderate in this area, and more attuned, one might say, to operational needs as opposed to the protection of privacy, there is no national security exception. So whatever the Court of Human Rights says about intelligence agency activity will affect us from that point of view.
Fascinating.
Well, if you're a lawyer, but quite worrying, I suspect, if you work in intelligence.
And in terms of the government's response so far, do you think those will address the points raised by the Court of Appeal?
Well, what they said they'd do in the consultation was really the two things that the Court of Appeal has said they must do. So you could say that they called that right. Will they be required to do more? Well, we'll have to wait for what the High Court and perhaps eventually the European Court of Justice says about that.
And what do you see has been the implications of this for whether or not Britain can get a data adequacy agreement with the EU?
Well, we will obviously need to be able to show that as well as implementing the data protection regulation, we, in other ways as well, provide equivalent protection to the privacy rights of our citizens and to data privacy. Does that mean we should immediately throw up our hands, assume the worst, and remove what are, in my experience, exceptionally useful capabilities, both for the detection and prosecution of crime and for keeping us safe at the national security level, not just from terrorism but from cyber attack? No, I would not counsel the government to do that. I think they are right to, of course, comply with the law, but equally question where the law appears not to be clear. And the Court of Appeal said this morning that the judgment in Davis and Watson, or Watson I should call it, is not clear. They should continue to challenge that. And I don't think by doing so they're going to put themselves in bad odour with other member states or indeed with the Commission. And if you look, for example, at the Watson case, you had, I think, 8 or 9 other member states supporting the UK in the submissions that the UK government was making about the great utility of this power and how important it was to keep it. You also had the European Commission on side. And indeed, as recently as 2005, there was a data retention directive passed by the European Parliament and the European Council, which required everybody in Europe to have a facility to require this data to be retained. The biggest problem, I suspect, on this issue, and perhaps generally with the adequacy agreement, will be in the court, where the Court of Justice at the moment has a very pro-privacy streak. And what we saw both in the American case with Safe Harbour and in the Canadian case with passenger name records, in effect, both those countries are in the position I assume we will be in, trying to achieve some sort of endorsement of the way they treat the data of Europeans. They got the deal through at the political level. It was at the legal level, and it was challenged in court that it came unstuck.
Stephen Doughty.
Thanks, Chair. Just briefly, given we're talking about technology, I just want to come to the other issue about social media companies and their sort of, hosting and dealing with terrorist or extremist content. Notwithstanding what you said about prescription earlier on and its limits and its weaknesses, obviously the list of prescribed organisations is there for everybody to see. We had evidence the other week from Twitter, Facebook and Google, YouTube, where they admitted that the only prescribed organisation they were actively searching for was ISIS-Daesh. Does that surprise you and concern you that they're not looking for the other prescribed organisations as a matter of routine? I
heard that evidence and it did surprise me. My sense is these companies are doing more than they did, but there are whole areas where they're not doing anything, and the area you identify is one of them. Another one that came to my mind is Google search, and I heard you questioning very skillfully, if I may say so, YouTube about their takedown policy and so on. But if you search on Google for the principal Islamic State magazine, I won't dignify it by naming it, or indeed publicise it, but the name is well known, and you click images, you come up on the very first line with illustrated instructions for how best to use your knife to kill somebody, how best to hire a vehicle, and how to deploy it in order to kill the maximum number of people on a pavement. And this from the master of search engine optimization, who, even if they believe it's wrong to ban the transmission of this sort of information, surely don't have to make it available on the very first line of a simple Google search. No. So no doubt they tell you they're doing what they can. It's good that they're at least trying to cooperate. But if I may say so, my message to you would be to keep up the pressure.
I mean, funny you mentioned that, because I was searching for things during the course of this hearing, and one of the first things that came up on Google was ISIS is not a terrorist organisation, which I just find extraordinary. That's one of the first things that pops up on the top of my search. But in terms of the sort of the basic standards, then they should be doing, you would say as a basic they should be sort of routinely searching for all prescribed organisations, at the very least.
Well, of course, we get into difficulties here that we're looking largely at American companies, in many cases West Coast countries. They have a distinctively American idea of free speech, and I've had the opportunity to talk about this with Google's general counsel. I suspect members of the committee probably have as well. So inevitably they will see some of these things differently. And if speech does not involve an imminent threat to an individual, then whether it comes from a terrorist organisation or not is not in their minds determinative of whether it should be banned. But I think they have to recognise that they're working now in a global environment, and they have to be responsive to concerns like this. I would rather they were responsive than we end up in a world where some heavy-handed attempt is made to regulate everything. One could imagine that coming. One has seen a sort of beginning of it in Germany with their...
Well, I mean, on that specifically, I mean, obviously Germany has taken that approach. What do you make of these proposals for tax or fines or some sort of more punitive measures being taken if they do, for example, fail to take down content? I mean, I reported a bunch of cases involving Northern Irish terrorist organisations at that hearing, and they've taken a month to remove an account on Twitter. They've just sent me the report in the last 2 days which says up the IRA. I mean that's not acceptable to me, and I would be inclined to go down the more punitive route. But what do you make of
Well, I think the German laws only started to operate very, very recently. I mean, I spoke to some Germans who were in quite a good position to know a couple of weeks ago who seemed to think it was a positive experiment, but it is, at the end of the day, an experiment. I think, that would be one possible way to press them if one were going to need to legislate. I think another way is transparency. I don't think they're telling us enough. They will come along, these companies, and tell you, we've got 5,000 extra people now looking at content. But if you say to them, how many of those are in Germany? They won't tell you. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the answer is they're all in Germany, because that's where the penalties are, in which case that might be a sign that a law like that is a good example. But more than that, if we are, as a state, effectively outsourcing these Ofcom-like functions, if you like, to private operators, that may be inevitable. It may be the way we have to go. But surely if we're going to do that, we need to see not just their terms of service, but the internal guidelines that they are applying when they decide to take this video down and to leave that one up. It seems to me that that's a bare minimum. And I think there's quite a lot as well to be said for transparency in terms of algorithms, but that's rather a different topic, possibly for a different committee.
Are you concerned about the algorithms and the way in which they operate, whether it be search algorithms or the kinds of algorithms that recommend you things once you're online, whether it be on a social media platform or any other?
There was an article recently in the Yale Journal of Regulation, which I assume is a reputable publication, though it's not my bedside reading, and it's about dispute resolution online. And it made the point that eBay resolves something like 60 million disputes a year between buyers and sellers. That's probably more than the entire court capacity of the Western world. And they didn't say this specifically of eBay, but they said it of some of these companies, that when they resolve a dispute, they're not just looking at who's right and who's wrong. They're looking at how many social media followers each party has, and they're looking at the e-commerce spend of the party to the dispute and their immediate family. In other words, and as a lawyer I'm horrified by this, you're more likely to win the case if you are rich and well connected. Well, if we are going again to outsource this adjudicative function, which is a core function of the state, to social media companies or online commerce companies, may be a very rational thing to do, certainly a lot easier clicking a few buttons than going down to the small claims court. But if we're going to do it, surely we ought to have transparency, we ought to have visibility of these algorithms, and we ought to have the ability, if we need to do so, to regulate them.
Do you think there's also an issue where if the purpose of the algorithm is to keep you clicking or to provide you with what you will be most likely to pursue next, that actually in fact what the algorithms do is promote extremism or shift people further on a journey towards extremism, because that's what will most motivate people to press the next click button? So do you think that actually, in fact, the way in which the algorithms are being designed and the business model itself is also potentially making this worse?
I don't have specialist knowledge of that, but it's a possibility. And I think this whole business of whether we regulate the internet and if so how is probably leave aside Brexit, it's probably the big legislative issue worldwide of the next 10 years. And actually, I rather admired something Liam Byrne wrote about this. He drew a comparison with the last industrial revolution. He said we had 13 sets of Factories Acts, and it took about 100 years before we tamed the worst abuses of the last industrial revolution. And I think anyone who thinks they've got easy answers to this one is deluding themselves. I think we've got a long way to go on this and a lot of thinking to do about it.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair. And could I apologise? I missed the earlier part of your evidence and the other committee to go to. So if this has already been covered, please just tell me. But I want to go back to your report. And there was media coverage when it was published that said in terms of tracking the attackers, there was some considerable similarities between your report and the report after the 2005 terrorist attacks. Do you think that is fair criticism because it was worded in such a way that really the intelligence agencies haven't moved on in that time, or is it because there are just far more people to track?
I think it's fair criticism, and it raises a really difficult issue when you're gathering intelligence that's applied not just here but in other countries as well, which is a person who was on the radar of the intelligence agencies maybe a few years ago, who is under surveillance. That surveillance throws up nothing particularly suspicious, so you throw them back into the pile which says not particularly interested but will remember that they were people once of interest. And the widely cited figure for former subjects of interest is 20,000. I think if you look carefully it's actually over 20,000. And as I said in my report, even that figure does not include former leads, so people who never actually got a file on them but came up in leads, nor does it include the historic cases of pre-2009 who aren't included in that figure. So it is a very large number of people. And the Intelligence and Security Committee in 2013 documented in rather surprising detail 4 different ways in which government had sought to identify which of those people were most likely to re-engage. And it was a problem here because of the 6 attackers in these 4 incidents I was looking at. 2 had been subjects of interest and were now in the past. But I think things are already better than they were. And I was able to say in relation to the Manchester attacker, Salman Abedi, while appreciating that this is absolutely no consolation to anyone who was affected by the attack, but they did get surprisingly close to him, despite the fact that he wasn't very high up anybody's list until very late on. And one of the ways they did that was they ran a huge exercise on all the former subjects of interest, very resource-intensive exercise, saying which ones are most likely to re-engage, looking at the various factors they fed in. And he came up in the very small number of people that were listed as a top priority to look at. They'd actually arranged a meeting for the 31st of May last year, as it happened was 9 days after the attack. Now, one of the problems with that exercise is that it wasn't performed often enough, and that is changing. I mean, that is now going to be performed effectively on a constant basis, or certainly more frequently. I think the other change that is really going to make a difference there is the better use of data. So one might be looking at data, for example, on travel patterns. That might give you some indication of should we be zeroing in and looking more carefully. But what, for example, about online purchasing? You know, we've seen plenty of examples of people buying bomb precursors online, assuming some basic level of cooperation from the companies involved. There might be room there for finding other sources that could help narrow down that search a little more. So it's always going to be difficult. You're looking at huge numbers of people. Human nature is unpredictable. Khalid Massoud, the Westminster attacker, was 52 years old. He had a history of violence, but He was released from prison for the last time in 2003 when he was 38 years old. I used to sit part-time as a criminal judge. I saw lots of men like that. Violent youth, get to their mid-30s, perspectives change, different priorities, and 12 years later, they're not going up at the top of anybody's list for a vicious assault on a police officer. But that happened, and that one, I think, would have been very difficult to spot, however clever your use of data.
So just on that, because there certainly seems to be a clear shift away from the cells operating and organisations and plotting these things with great accuracy from that point of view, to just going and purchasing a couple of big knives and hiring a car, and almost a more amateur way of carrying out these attacks. Do you think the security services are adapting enough can they prevent these, or to see a progression within an individual that may lead to that individual carrying out an attack?
They're just much more difficult to prevent. If you've been radicalised very quickly, probably online, largely. If you've bought a couple of knives or hired a van, then it's going to be difficult to stop you. Whereas if you're taking directions from Pakistan or Syria and there are 15 people in on the plot and you've been inquisitive about airline security systems and so on, then you're leaving traces and clues all the time. So the potential damage is less from these do-it-yourself attacks, but it's always going to be more difficult to stop them, as indeed we see in Northern Ireland, where a lot of the attacks are not at all sophisticated. I mean, you're looking at improvised explosive devices, maybe a homemade mortar someone's welded together in a barn, and the number of casualties is small. But even in that small place, with the amount of police activity there is, there are frequent terrorist attacks, much more so, of course, than in Great Britain.
But can the agencies, the police and others, adapt their techniques to try and address this? Are they doing it enough? If this is going to be a new preferred model, because people see it's easier to get to their eventual outcome that they want, because they don't leave this trail, surely we as or the police and the agencies have to adapt to that model.
Yes. Well, all I can say is that they are. I mean, I can assure you they are not sitting around an MI5 longing for the good old days of Operation Overt, when people were signalling an intention to bring down 8 transatlantic airliners. They are adapting, but the way they would put it is not that the age of the big plot has gone and we're now just involved in people with knives from B&Q. Only a few weeks ago there was a plot to bring down an airliner in Australia, which you may have seen, which might have had other ramifications. We had airliners brought down in Sharm el-Sheikh, Sinai, one of those only an attempt, but the desire for the big spectacular hasn't gone, so I think they need the capability to react to the big ones as well as the small ones. And as we saw from Salman Abedi, I don't know how you would put him, and we have to be careful because his brother has not yet been extradited, and the intention is to put him on trial. But although he was certainly not acting as part of a large group, you had a pretty sophisticated explosive device which was apparently put together rather quickly and rather easily.
And you did allude to some of these things just being ordered. Some of the committee were at the NCA last week and looked at the dark web and found how easy it was to go from a normal computer screen to the dark web, and it just looks like Amazon that you're going shopping. What more can be done to support NCA and others to stop the sale of these goods on the dark web?
Well, and it's a very specific question. My message really would be, don't despair. Yes, the dark web sounds terrible, but don't forget Silk Road, which was a big drugs site on the dark web, was taken down twice by the FBI. WhatsApp is a wonderfully secure method of communication. But judging from my newspaper this morning, what people write on WhatsApp sometimes gets to a wider audience. And although SIGINT and digital intelligence is terribly important, it isn't the only future. Human intelligence and old-fashioned techniques of deception and subterfuge still have an important part to play.
And finally, you mentioned in some of the other answers about mental health and such like. Do you think there is, and it's obviously very difficult, but do you think more can be done to look at the mental health of an individual in terms of the people you looked at in these attacks? And were there signs earlier that could have been acted upon that weren't? And how do we deal with that as another tool in terms of preventing these attacks going forward?
Well, I don't want to sound as though I'm here to defend the security services and say that we've already thought of that, but it is something they've thought a lot about. There's an extremism analysis unit within MI5 that I've spent some time with, and one of the very useful joint police and MI5 initiatives was the Lone Actor Initiative. Now, of course, lone actors are not all mentally ill, but more of them are mentally ill than people who work in cells. And they've worked together to pool their expertise so that one could look for warning signs that somebody might be a lone actor. And in fact, I recorded in my report, I hope, otherwise I shouldn't tell you, but I think I did, that Khurram Butt was put through two of these assessments. Are they going to find everybody? No, I'm afraid they're not. But just as there is no inevitable pathway from religious extremism into terrorism, so of course there is no inevitable pathway from mental illness into terrorism. It's a factor, it's a risk factor, but you're looking at an awful lot of people who are mentally ill, most of whom will always lead blameless lives.
Nasha?
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. I'm not sure whether you've seen the Runnymede Trust Islamophobia report on the 20th anniversary of the definition of Islamophobia. But one of the things that they found with the PREVENT strategy in particular was that they were uncomfortable with it in terms of racism. And their recommendation, I'll read it to you, there should be a full, independent and fully transparent inquiry into the government's counter-terrorism strategy. The government should recognise its statutory equality obligations as set out in the public sector equality duty in the implementation of all counter-terrorism policies. Counter-terrorism measures must not lead to discrimination on the grounds of race, colour, religion, descent or national or ethnic origin in purpose or effect. So my question would be, when you were reviewing the legislation, was there ever any EQIAs, or were there, and if there were they published, and has it ever been reviewed since it was implemented?
Well, I certainly never conducted any such formal assessment. I did every year look at the question of whether I thought there was discrimination on the grounds of race among people being questioned in the street and among people in particular being questioned at the port. And some people on both sides used my evidence in the case of Begal, which ended up in the Supreme Court. It split the Supreme Court. 4 said that it was not disproportionate, and the other one said that he thought it was indirectly discriminatory. So that issue, particularly in relation to Schedule 7, has certainly gone through the courts. But no, I haven't been involved in any formal exercise such as you described.
So there's never been an equality impact assessment on the counter-terrorism strategy?
I couldn't say that for sure, but it's simply not something that I was ever asked to do.
Okay. So do you think integration, women's rights and other similar topics should be tackled under the umbrella of extremism, or do you think that by doing so it poisons the entire discussion?
I think what we've lacked over the last years is a proper strategy for social cohesion and integration, and I think as a consequence of that, or perhaps simply because it seems easier to find money when something has a counter-terrorism label on, PREVENT has been asked to do too much. I don't think it's a great way to encourage cohesion or integration to go in and say, we're part of a strategy that's here to stop you becoming terrorists.
So if you think extremism is not the space for these issues, then what do you think might be included within the Extremism Commission? Well,
I think really they've got to work out what they think they're about. I mean, there is a definition of extremism. It's not a particularly precise one, but one perhaps doesn't need a particularly precise one to work with. Certainly not for me to give advice to the new lead commissioner, but if I were confronted with what I consider is a very difficult job, I suspect rather than spend a lot of time trying to produce a watertight definition, which I suspect would be impossible, I might try and identify 3 or 4 strands of extremism from various different perspectives that it might make sense to try and tackle. I mean, that might be a more practical way of going about it than getting hung up on definitions, which I don't think at the end of the day are going to get us very far.
So it's a conversation about tackling extremism, or is it? So where? And I asked this earlier. What exactly do you think this commission will be doing? Because if we're talking about, is it to look at extremism, and given your recommendations, from what you said in your 15 points, extremism isn't where the focus needs to be. in terms of a conversation that we're having. So point A, so what you've said is, for those concerned with the bill and its progress, 15 issues of particular sensitivity may be defined. How extremist activity is defined as one of them. And then the reasons for believing that existing means of control, that these are the ones that I've picked out of 15, including the various precursor offences under the Terrorism Act, as well as hate speech offences. So again, it comes to that conversation, is it thought policing? Because are we not eroding some of our British values by actually stopping some conversations to happen? Because isn't that one of our strong British values? And for me, certainly when we're talking about the Muslim issues, there is absolutely no conflict between my Muslim values and British values. There is zero conflict between either. And religious conservatism isn't extremism. So where is this conversation going? And I have serious concerns about it.
When I did my programme, I visited a school, you probably know, Carlton Bolling College in Bradford. And I sat through a 2-hour session with 12 and 13-year-olds where the English teacher, who was also an imam, this is a 95% Muslim school, was talking them through tolerance, what it meant to be extreme, what it meant to be intolerant, and from there they got on to violence and terrorism, and it was a really useful session. They were shown footage of a horrible terrorist atrocity in Pakistan where a lot of children were killed, and to watch these young Bradford kids look at the screen as children just like them were screaming in terror and people just like their mums and dads were trying to rescue them and make it better, I thought was a really, really powerful message, and it was a good example of how this thing should be done. Now, Carlton Bolling, they don't think they can sell that sort of thing under the Prevent label because it puts too many people's backs up. So they call it, I think, getting on together. And that would be my example of something that, do you really need to deal with it under the strategy of we're going to stop you becoming terrorists, or should it be more part of the social education that everyone in this country needs?
Well, I agree with you, David, in terms of it. We need to look at it from a safeguarding point of view, because like you've touched on, the majority of referrals from Channel under the contest strategy end up being referred to mental health institutions, other areas where it's not necessarily about extremism or terrorism per se. And I absolutely agree with the conversations that need to happen, but without the whole British values, the terminology British values and how it's applied to the conversations of extremism. If we go back to the President Club dinner, that was something that's been going on. Which bit of that was British values? There's this conversation that we're not having about how do we define British values until it comes to Parliament and we actually see what happened, and that's closed down now. That was allowed, which bit of that was British values? So I think, for me, there's a conversation to be had about how we're defining all of this.
Yeah.
That's a pretty wide-ranging final question for you.
Well, I'll give you a short answer. I agree with you that such a general definition cannot be safely used as a backing for coercive measures. That's why I described the Counter-Extremism Bill, when I was allowed to see it in an early draft in 2015, as the most concerning document I'd seen in 4 or 5 years as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. But does that mean that schools and others, civil society groups, have no part in countering Islamophobia, in countering sexism, in countering other tendencies that threaten a plural and diverse and tolerant society? No, it doesn't. They absolutely do have that function, and I think the state has the function also to facilitate it and, if necessary, to support it. And if that's what a counter-extremism strategy means, then I can live with it.
We thank you very much for your time this afternoon and for the wide range of issues that you have responded to us on. We obviously look forward to taking evidence from your successor in due course as well. But I just wanted to conclude by giving you our thanks on behalf of Parliament for the immense amount of work that you have done on behalf of all of us, both in terms of protecting our security and also protecting civil liberties and the public service that you have given, and we very much appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.